Hello, scientists! Today we're going to talk about a few principles of experimental design. Our big idea for this lesson is that with a well-designed experiment, we can test the questions that we have about our observations. So let's start by defining observations and then what we think about them, inferences. So an observation is information that's detected by our senses. So that's our sight, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. As scientists, when we make observations, we want them to be specific and mean the same to everyone so that others can understand what we're observing. So, for example, I might eat a piece of chocolate and observe, ew, this is gross. But that might not be what you observe about chocolate. So I might say, this tastes sweet, because I know that you will have an understanding of what sweet tastes like. We make two kinds of observations. Quantitative, the root word is quantity. These observations use numbers. Or qualitative, the root word is quality. And these are more like characteristics or descriptions that use words. So if I'm describing the chemistry lab, I might say this lab has 4 windows. That would be a quantitative observation because it uses numbers. Or I might say this room is green. That would be qualitative. For our example observation, I'm going to say our classroom smells like chemicals. That might be something that you observe when you walk in our classroom some days. Something that we're doing all the time just as human beings is then making inferences about our observations. An inference is a possible explanation or interpretation about an observation. So when I walk in the chemistry lab, if I didn't know what it was, I might look around the room and say, oh, there's a chemical hood, there are faucets, there's a periodic table, and then to explain that information, I would say, oh, I must be in a chemistry classroom or a science classroom. That would be my inference about what I've observed. If I walk in the dining hall and it smells like French fries and chicken nuggets, I would infer that that's what's for lunch. So for our observation, our classroom smells like chemicals, I might infer that we must be doing an experiment today. Sometimes our observations and inferences are what they are. We observe things, we think about them, and that's fine. Other times we have questions about them, and we might want to go on to do research or go on to do an experiment to learn more. Once we have an experimental question, we're going to want to define some variables to make sure that we're actually learning what we want to learn. So we'll have 3 kinds of variables: independent, dependent, and controlled. Your independent variable is what you, the scientist, are changing. You're actively changing it to learn something. So often when we write independent variables, we might write this versus this. Our dependent variable is what's changing in response. I'm making some change to the independent variable, and as a result, the dependent variable is changing. We want to make sure that it is measurable in the best case, or we can observe the change in some way. Ideally, we would like our dependent variable to be quantitative or numbers. That lets us make a nice graph. Finally, we have controlled variables. These are variables that we keep constant. If we didn't control them, then they would sort of be messing up or changing the results that we're seeing in our dependent variable. This leads to error in our experiments. Once we've designed our experiment, defined our variables, and thought about what we're going to do, it's time to make a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess. You've probably done some research about your topic or tried to look up to see if you could just find the answer online, and that research is what makes your guess educated. You're coming to this guess with some background information. In this class, we'll write hypotheses with an if, then, because format. So if, then something about our independent variable, then something about our dependent variable, because, something that you've probably learned in your research. Why you think that if-then or cause and effect relationship will be true. Let's look at a few examples. In our first example, I'm asking, does eating breakfast affect test performance? My independent variable, the thing that I, the scientist, am going to change, is I'm going to have some people eat breakfast and some people not eat breakfast. What I'll measure, or my dependent variable, are my test scores. So what I've done in these examples that we're looking at is I've highlighted all the information about the independent variable in blue and all the information about the dependent variable in this orange coppery color. So you can see where they appear in the question, in the hypothesis, and then later on in the graph. For my controlled variables, I want to think about what other things might affect test performance, right? If I give some people a harder test and some people an easier test, then that might affect how they do. So that would be a controlled variable. Another thing might be how much studying my students have done, right? So if you studied more and you didn't eat breakfast, that might affect your score. So I'll want to control these in some way. Finally, I'll write a hypothesis, and this is the one I wrote. So if a person eats breakfast, right, something about my independent variable, then they are more likely to score better, something about my dependent variable. And then because they'll be able to reason or think better. Here's my second example. My question is, does temperature affect the life of a battery? What I, the scientist, am going to change is the temperature that I'm running my battery at. And what I'll measure is how long the battery lasts, or the battery life. That'll be a time, right? Quantitative. And then other things that might affect how long the battery lasts are what device is being used, right? I might put my battery in a radio, or I might put it in an alarm clock, and that might have a different draw on the battery. And also the type of battery, right? Like a AA versus a AAA will probably last longer. So I want to keep these the same. I'll want to run this experiment by only putting batteries in clocks and only using AA batteries. Another thing might be the brand of battery that I would want to control. Finally, I have my hypothesis. So I am hypothesizing that if the temperature is colder, that's something about my independent variable, then the battery will last longer, something about my dependent variable, because the chemical reaction will happen at a slower rate. That's something that I learned or have thought about from my research into this question. Finally, let's talk briefly about some graphing principles. On our x-axis, we'll always put our independent variable, and on our y-axis, we'll always put our dependent variable. And when we write those, we'll include the title followed by a unit in parentheses. So for temperature, I would write temperature as my title, and then probably degrees Celsius as my unit in parentheses. I'll show you this in a minute. In this class, we'll mostly make two kinds of graphs. The first kind is bar graphs. And we'll use these if our independent variable, the thing that we're changing, is qualitative, or words. The other kind of graph that we'll use is an XY scatter or a line graph. And we'll use these if our independent variable is quantitative, or numbers, because this way we'll be able to plot points, because we'll have two sets of variables, independent and dependent, that are both numbers. So let's look at this in action for our two examples. In our first example, whether or not you ate breakfast was our independent variable. So I'll have breakfast, and then I have eaten and not eaten there. Breakfast doesn't really have a unit, so it's okay to not have one in this case. And then my dependent variable is test scores, and I'm going to include that as a percent. So my units there, percent in parentheses. Because my independent variable is words, or qualitative, I'm going to use a bar graph here. And I'm going to make this graph to match my hypothesis, so the eaten breakfast scores are higher. And this is something that you'll practice in our class, is making a hypothesis-style graph. That's just kind of a rough sketch so that you know what your graph might look like later on. In our second example, our independent variable was temperature. In science classes, we usually measure that in degrees Celsius. So I'll put that on my x-axis, my horizontal axis. And then my dependent variable was battery life. And I'm going to guess that the unit that's going to be appropriate is hours. Could be minutes, could be days, depending on the scale. But my guess is that it'll be hours. So I have abbreviated there, HRS for hours in parentheses. And because both of my variables are quantitative, or numbers, I'll be able to plot points, or have the computer do it for me. And so this will be a line graph. And I'll sketch in a line that matches my hypothesis. So a colder temperature means more battery life. So the line slopes downward. That's it for today. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.